Welcome to a special edition of the Undercovers podcast. I'm your host, Ben, and today I'm doing a special episode where I have Brian Drake. And Brian, if you want to introduce yourself to the audience, where we can find your work and a little bit more about what you do in your background, that would be awesome.
Hey, man. So thanks for having me on, Ben. First of all, I'm an Oswego guy, just like you, upstate New Yorker, living here in Syracuse, doing my work at fantasypoints.com right now. You can see all the podcasts that I do, either on the Fantasy Points podcast stream or youtube.com/fantasypoints. I'm on Twitter. I'll never call it X. It's the dumbest thing in the world. At
Yeah, I'll
Drake.
always be the bird.
Yeah. At Drake Fantasy. Come hang out with me there. And it's a fun time. I've done the PFF show on Sirius XM for the last 2 seasons as the host every Sunday, and podcast as part of the Fantasy Football Hustle with my pal Dwayne McFarland, who's at Fantasy Life now. So I'm all over the place in the fantasy world, but I'm excited to be here with you, chopping it up, talking a little fantasy.
All right, Brian. Again, thank you so much for coming on here. And just to start off, I feel like the big thing that most fantasy owners are really looking at, and I did my first draft on Sunday, so I kind of had an idea. But Jonathan Taylor's like a hot name. Like 2021, obviously he was the best running back, and then he's pretty much universally picked number one last year, and then he had such a disappointing season. I mean, where would you still take him in the first round?
No, I would not be taking Jonathan Taylor at this point. I do a show with John Hansen, he's the morning show host at SiriusXM, runs fantasypoints.com. He actually had Adam Schefter on earlier this week, and Schefter was telling him in not so many words, he's like, listen, I wouldn't touch Jonathan Taylor because Jonathan Taylor, and the most likely outcomes are he gets a new contract, which the Colts say they don't want to do, or he gets traded. So you kind of got to have a risk tolerance. How high or low do you want to go here? Do you think he comes back and eventually plays for the Colts? I don't know. It seems like he's digging his heels in, and maybe he'll come up with some quote unquote injuries where he doesn't have to play, or they trade him. If I'm looking to take Jonathan Taylor this year, I'm hoping he slides like the third round, to be honest. I'm not touching him in the first. I can't risk my first round pick being a guy who sits out a number of games, or he's just unhealthy, or pulls one of these deals where all of a sudden halfway through the year, oh, my hamstring hurts, I'm going to sit out and wait till the next contract comes around. So I'm kind of out on JT, but if he falls in a draft and everyone else in your league is doing the same, maybe it's the third round, you can take a shot on him. You're at the 2-3 turn, something like that. Other than that, though, I'm kind of out at this point, Ben.
Now, it seems like there's kind of a similar situation with Josh Jacobs contract-wise, but he doesn't have the injury concerns. But do you have the same mindset when it comes to Josh Jacobs in these drafts as well?
Yeah, I've drafted Jacobs a little bit, and we've got Josh Jacobs right now at Fantasy Points as RB10 right now, and that's a guy coming off the board 30th overall in his ADP. So you're looking early third round. Again, do you think he's going to come back and play? He really has come out and said, I want a new contract, or I don't want to be here with the Raiders. The Raiders are in total rebuild mode. They have no reason to give him more money. And would they trade him? Possibly, but who's giving up a draft pick and more capital for a running back these days? That never seems to happen. So I'm kind of in the same boat with Josh Jacobs. Like, I'm going to let somebody else be a hero with these guys. There's enough good talent with Nick Chubb, Saquon Barkley, Tony Pollard. I don't need to get in the business with these guys who have question marks hanging over their head.
Now, Cooper Kupp had a down year because of his injury. Do you feel like he can bounce back, or would you still kind of, maybe shy away from him because of, not a great situation in Los Angeles? I mean, I know they still have Stafford there, but the offense, I mean, they're obvious rebuild mode. So, I mean, who knows if Stafford's even going to play all 17 games?
Yeah, Cooper Kupp, I put a video out earlier this summer where I said that Cooper Kupp could lead the league in targets and therefore I think lead the league in receiving. It's just a matter of how long he plays, and probably more importantly, how long Matthew Stafford plays. This is a team with a really bad defense. They've got very few skill position players around him. I mean, Van Jefferson could be a nice sleeper for you later in drafts because they just don't have anybody else to throw the football to. But I'm still in on Cooper Kupp because as long as this team is fighting and he's on the field, he's going to see likely double-digit targets every single week, and you can't pass up that opportunity in fantasy football. So again, it's a perfect storm of awfulness in Los Angeles where the team's bad, they're going to be behind all the time, and there's no one else to throw to but him. So I'm still in. If you can get Cooper Kupp in the first round of your fantasy drafts, I'll sign off on that.
Now, Justin Jefferson, I think, is pretty much the consensus, number one overall pick. And it really seems like within the last couple of years, like the receivers and running backs have almost switched in terms of value goes. You see that continuing, and could you see, mostly wide receivers going in the first round in most drafts?
In home leagues, like the ones you and I are going to be playing in soon, where you're drafting in someone's backyard or it's an online draft with your old buddies from high school and college, people are still going to gravitate to running backs because there's that fear of missing out,
Right.
like, oh my gosh, I don't want to go into the season and all of a sudden, my RB1 is, Jamal Williams or something like that. You're pulling your hair out week to week. But if you look at these receivers and the numbers they can put up on a week-to-week basis, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill, I was just tweeting about him today. People forget Tyreek Hill, who has an ADP of 4 on Underdog right now. Tyreek Hill last year was second in receptions, third in targets, second in yards, and 5th overall among non-quarterbacks in fantasy points per game. 4 of those games were started by Teddy Bridgewater and Skylar Thompson. If he can have Tua Tagovailoa play every single game for him this year, I think Tyreek Hill has a chance to be the number one player in fantasy. But back to your question about wide receivers overtaking running backs, look at your league setup also. Do you have to start 2 or maybe 3 wide receivers? Are there multiple flex spots? Is it a full point PPR? I'm still always, I have a soft spot for Christian McCaffrey. If I can get CMC on my team in the middle, early part of first round, I'm going to do it because he's such a difference maker. With he and Austin Eckler being the only running back scoring over 300 fantasy points last year in a PPR, those are guys that can make a big difference on your team versus everybody else. So if you want to get one of those guys early and then just follow up and hammer away at wide receiver in the next few rounds, the T. Higgins, Devonta Smiths, Chris Olaves of the world, I'm cool with that. But, I have no problem seeing guys start with 2, 3 wide receivers and then just kind of taking their shot on running backs in those middle rounds with Miles Sanders and Isaiah Pacheco types.
Now, I know you mentioned obviously the league setup being important, but if you're doing a standard league, whatever, 2 wide receivers, 2 running backs, 1 tight end, 1 flex, is there an added value for getting a guy like Travis Kelce who could put up wide receiver like numbers from that tight end spot?
I don't think it matters what your league size is if you can get Travis Kelce. I had him last year in a league called the Kings Classic. It's the best of the best in fantasy football. We drafted the Pro Football Hall of Fame. I had the Kelce Mahomes stack, and I rode it to a regular season championship all the way to the finals. In a league like that, where maybe say it's 10 teams, you want to differentiate because everybody has kind of a super team. The waiver wire is loaded, but where you can really differentiate yourself is at a position like that with Travis Kelce, because nobody can touch the production that he's put up with for the last few years. So I'm fine with anybody who goes out there and says, I want to take Travis Kelce in the first round. God bless you. You'll never hear me say a bad thing. If you want to take him in the top 5, I'm cool with it because you'll have such an advantage over your competition. He had 100 more fantasy points than the next best tight end last year. That's just ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah, and for something like that, when you got such a dramatic drop off between the number 1 and number 2, I mean, you get a significant advantage from having Kelce versus Andrews.
Yeah, and Andrews, I think, will have a very good year. He just didn't have Lamar last year, but their backups were okay. I mean, you can look at some numbers and say, hey, Mark Andrews performed almost better with some of these backups, but this is going to be an offense that's going to throw the football more in Baltimore. They're getting away from that old Greg Roman ground and pound, and Lamar and this new bevy of weapons he has is going to throw the rock. I don't mind going and getting Travis Kelce, but I see how people are deterred and they go, I can't spend that first round pick on a tight end. if you're in a home league and maybe Mark Andrews falls to the 3rd round to you, or maybe a little later, you got to pounce on that because he's a difference maker, not to the Kelsey level, but he's very, very good. So I love Mark Andrews this year in an offense that should throw the ball a lot more than years past.
Now, shifting to the Bills, just because, we mostly talk about the Bills. And speaking of tight ends, are you in or out on the Dalton Kincaid hype train this season?
So if you look at what Dalton Kincaid did in the first preseason game, and we're recording this, obviously before the Bills play their next game, I want to say he played almost every snap but one with Josh Allen on that series with the Bills starters.
Kyle Allen, Josh didn't play.
Excuse me, Kyle Allen.
You're good.
So with the starters, with the starting skill players that were out there, I mean, to me, that shows they're probably going to play a lot of 11 personnel where you're going to have 3 receivers and 1 running back. And he's going to play a lot of slot, right? If they go 12 and you get Dawson Knox, out there on the field too. Dawson Knox is not the elite playmaker in the open field that Dalton Kincaid is. And this Dalton and Dawson thing is going to kill me all year long with these two.
It's going to kill me as well.
But traditionally, outside of Kyle Pitts a few years ago when he put up 1,000 yards, rookie tight ends just don't produce to a level that I think our hype wants us to believe. But if a kid like Dalton Kincaid can come into an offense with Buffalo, it's Stephon Diggs. Then there's a big step down to Gabe Davis. And we'll see if Trent Sherfield maybe can step up. Khalil Shakir seems like he's not doing great this preseason in camp. So somebody's got to catch the football in Buffalo. We know they're going to be among the lead leaders in passing attempts this year. So I don't mind taking him. I think also if you're going to take a Dalton Kincaid, you've got to back him up with somebody else. You got to make sure you've got a David Njoku or even like a Chigakonkwo, Pat Freiermuth, somebody like that who's, just in case it doesn't happen and it doesn't click year one, you're not, stuck holding the bag with a rookie tight end and you got to go to the waiver wire at that point.
Right. And I will say one last point about that. I think and even when you talk about Kyle Pitts, like most of these rookie tight ends aren't going into an offense like Buffalo and, immediately becoming like the second, passing option and one of the top passing offenses in the league. Now, keeping it just with the Bills for a second, James Cook, I know some people think he could be a potential top 10 running back even in fantasy. How do you feel about James this season?
Boy, he's really shooting up the board. We've got him as he's at RB 25 right now at fantasy points. But I think that number is going to go up. You're going to see his ADP really start to skyrocket. And he's going to be a guy who I think in the next 2-3 weeks, James Cook's going to be going in like the 4th or 5th round of some drafts because teams are going to say, wait a minute, they're not giving the ball to Damian Harris, who's a little banged up. Latavius Murray's 100 years old behind him. Syracuse guy, Latavius Murray went to Onondaga Central High School. So James Cook, if he has that 3-down role, and he's getting a little work inside the 20s, that was always the knock on James Cook. They're saying, they're not going to give him the goal line carries. Well, I think we saw that in the preseason opener. They gave him a carry. Was it inside the 10 or whatever?
Yeah, it was like an 8-yard touchdown run. Yeah, so it would have been inside the 10.
The problem with the Bills offense in terms of a goal line back, their goal line back is Josh Allen. He's going to steal a number of rushing touchdowns from James Cook. But if you're going to take a bunch of receivers early, like we said earlier in the show, now you come back after you drafted 2-3 wide receivers and you say, all right, I'm going to get James Cook in here. And then, I'll start picking up some other guys. Like you said, Pacheco, maybe Kamara. You wait on him to do suspension, Khalil Herbert. Now you're cooking with some gas because it's all upside from there. So I'm in on James Cook. I think as the weeks approach towards my other fantasy drafts, I'm going to be creeping him up my board a little higher, Ben.
Now, and I feel like, too, I mean, you talked earlier about McCaffrey and Eckler. I'm not saying he's going to be them, but just because if you're in a PPR league, I think there's a little extra added value to a running back, who can also catch the ball out of the backfield, too. And I think, that's one of Cook's strong points. So I think that's some extra value you get from Cook. Now, how do you feel about these running backs coming off of torn ACLs? Because We see it almost every year. Saquon Barkley, it took him 2 years to become the player he was. McCaffrey, it took him a little while after his injuries. It's really only just Adrian Peterson is the one, he's almost the complete anomaly to the, ACL running back rule. But do you see Javonte or Brees possibly, being worthy of a draft selection?
I took Brees Hall in the 3rd round of the Kings Classic this past weekend, and I thought I had a steal in my hands. And then, here comes Dalvin Cook, to to the Jets. So that kicked me right in the crotch. I like Brees Hall. I think if he didn't get hurt, he'd be a top 5 pick in fantasy right now. At this point, though, with Dalvin Cook added to the mix, forget about it. Javonte Williams, they love him out in Denver. They added Samaje Perine, who's a really smart middle round pick for you folks out there. You're looking for somebody who I think has a standalone week-to-week value and could play a significant role if Javonte is not up to speed. And they're going to play Javonte Williams this week in preseason game number 2. So we're going to get a great look at him, see how he's looking before we have to make this selection on draft day. You always find with these guys coming off an ACL, there's always some other injury that pops up the next year. Usually it's a hamstring or some of this because they're trying to overcompensate. So I don't necessarily want one of those guys to be my number 1, but if they fall to a round where, hey, this guy can be a high upside second running back for me, I'm fine with that. And I just want to make sure I bake in some insurance around them. So my whole season's not dependent on Brees Hall or Javonte Williams. But if they can, especially Javonte, if he can hit in an offense in Denver that's going to run the football a ton under Sean Payton, he could have, league-winning value for you in maybe the 4th, 5th, 6th round.
Yeah, and it seems like, at least for running backs, like the recent trend has almost been like at the end of the season, it's been the waiver wire guys who've been coming in clutch for the championships. Like, I don't know how many fantasy championships Cam Akers helped win last year.
Sure.
And speaking of Cam Akers, I mean, he's now a full year removed from that Achilles. I know there's some major turmoil with him in LA, but they seem to smooth things out. And, he was running well at the end of last season. Are you in on Cam Akers this year?
I'm pulling up a video I did it with Cam Akers, and you look at what Cam Akers did last year, and it was really phenomenal. He was a guy who went from the penthouse at the beginning of the season to the outhouse back to being a league winner. And he's a guy who didn't catch a receiving touchdown last year. It was just all volume. So last year, Cam Akers was number 2 in the NFL on percentage of team carries inside the 5-yard line at nearly 89%. So he's the goal line back for the Rams. Now you say, well, how many goal line carries are the Rams going to get this year? It doesn't matter. He's the guy who's going to get them. Last year, weeks 13 through 18, he had the 5th best rushing yards per game. He was number 1 in the NFL in missed tackles, 4th, and he was 4th in PPR points at nearly 18. This is a guy right here who's a value. If you're getting him, in the 60s of your draft, again, how good are the Rams going to be? I don't know. They could end up tanking and trying to get, the number 1 overall pick. But I'm fine with Cam Akers on my team, maybe as my second back and having a real strong season because he's a good player. When he came out of Florida State, he's a very talented guy who can catch the football. So maybe Sean McVay finds a way to incorporate him even more in the offense, and make him, a league winner all year long and not just the final few weeks of the year.
Now, going over to quarterbacks, where do you normally target your quarterbacks in the draft? And I mean, it seems recently you'll find your guys like Kyler Murray, Justin Fields, and a lot of guys like those dual threat quarterbacks. But obviously, I feel like not all of them are created equal. When you talk about maybe a guy like Fields compared to like a Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts, but I mean, you still got Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert finishing top 5 fantasy quarterbacks without providing any value with their legs. So how do you feel about taking quarterbacks in the drafts, Brian?
I took Jalen Hurts as the second quarterback in the 14-team Kings Classic draft last week. And it was a matter of you get to a point in your draft where you're just kind of stuck and you're like, well, I don't like any of these running backs, and there's a big receiver teardrop. And I think that's when you can pull the trigger and say, all right, is Hurts here? Is Allen here? I'm worried about Lamar and his knee. I've got a friend of mine who works in the medical field in the NFL, and he told me that Lamar, just put a pin in Lamar, because he and his people around him don't like to do things the right way when it comes to the medical field. And they're kind of just like, well, we're just going to let it heal on its own. And so be careful with Lamar. Two guys I like a little later in drafts. Well, not that Justin Herbert's falling that late, but he's QB7 off the board by ADP. Justin Herbert's going to be in a situation where they're going to throw the ball down the field a lot more with a new offensive coordinator. He's got great weapons around him. Last year, through his first 2 games, when everybody was actually healthy, he threw for 300 yards or over 600 yards and 6 touchdowns in those first 2 games. Then he got hurt with a rib injury, and it was kind of all downhill from there. If you want to wait a little bit, Dak Prescott, his value is so suppressed right now. I mean, his ADP is over 100. This is a guy who, 2 years ago, lit the league on fire. Now he's added Brandon Cooks, a healthy Michael Gallup, CeeDee Lamb, another year mature, great offensive line around him, coaching for his job, and Mike McCarthy. I think Dak is sneaky if you want to wait. Let everybody else spend a high pick on, Mahomes, Hurts, and Allen. You're not going to get that much of a drop off to Dak Prescott and a team that's going to contend for the NFC Championship.
Now, I know I mentioned Kincaid a little bit earlier, but I'm going to just kind of go back to these rookies. Do you feel that that maybe AR-15 has some upside, maybe stash him as like a backup and just see how he does? Because I know the Colts, they finished near the bottom of the league last year, but if you look at their schedule, they play the NFC South. Obviously, they play their own division. So, I mean, they have a pretty weak schedule, and they'll probably mostly be playing from behind. So, I mean, that's opportunity for, big plays. And, I mean, you saw a little bit in that preseason game. I mean, he's already named the starting quarterback. What are your thoughts on AR-15?
Well, when you're playing fantasy football, you want guys who are going to have the ball in their hands, are going to have opportunities. This kid is going to have the ball in his hand every snap, and he's going to run a ton. I won a fantasy championship a few years ago with Tim Tebow as my quarterback. Tim Tebow couldn't throw the ball, across a swimming pool. He's that bad. But Richardson is super athletic. He's got a nice receiving core around him. I think they're underrated. Pittman and the crew out there. Does he get Jonathan Taylor back? I think it would sure help him. Yeah, that would help any rookie quarterback to have that running game alongside him. But imagine if he doesn't have Jonathan Taylor. And now I think he's going to take off and run even more. So could he run for near 1,000 yards, what Justin Fields did last year? Maybe, probably not, but I'll take him. And then what I want to do is come back a few rounds later with a guy like Aaron Rodgers or a Tua to make sure I've got a little insurance there, because you can't put all your eggs in the Anthony Richardson basket, because he could face plant. They could pull him for a few weeks and put Gardner Minshew in. So just have a backup plan. And I think Aaron Rodgers is a great one in that situation.
Now, going over to the running back position, rookie running back position, Bijan is taken anywhere, top 5 to being the first fantasy running back overall. But I honestly think there's more value to Jahmyr Gibbs, because in that offense, you got a better quarterback, and you obviously saw just how well Ben Johnson called their offense last year, and they're going to use him in similar ways. I don't know if I trust, Ritter down there, and I feel like, Gibbs, he's probably going to be drafted a little bit later. I feel like Gibbs would be the guy to target.
Gibbs is the guy who is going to step into a role vacated by DeAndre Swift last year. And DeAndre Swift still put up like top 15 numbers. There was an offense that didn't want to play him. He barely touched the football. The offensive line in Detroit is fantastic. That's a top 3 offensive line. They spent a top 12 pick on this kid. And I don't know if you guys have seen the video on social media of the Lions war room when they traded down and they still were able to get him. They lost their minds because they think Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be the centerpiece of this offense. Now, David Montgomery is a good player, very capable runner there, but the NFL is all about explosive plays and getting people in space. Jahmyr Gibbs is a guy you can get in space. And on the outside for Detroit, it's Amon-Ra St. Brown and, who else? Jameson Williams isn't playing for 6 weeks. I think Josh Reynolds is looking like their number 2 right now. So I think in the pass game in a full PPR, Jahmyr Gibbs is a really nice player. And the nice thing about him, maybe some guys in your home league, they don't know about him. They didn't watch him play at Alabama. They're not sure, like, who is this Jahmyr Gibbs? I know they got Montgomery. I think he'll fall a little bit in home leagues just because of the unknown. Rookies always go that way in home league drafts. But yeah, if you can get your hands on him, I think he's going to be a really good player.
Now, going, to the defensive side of things, where do you normally take your defenses? Because I know some people, and especially home leagues, you're obviously going up against maybe less informed people or, less experienced, but I feel like some people like to stream their defenses, maybe go up against, like, they'll face a team like, I don't know, in years past, obviously not this year, but, in 3 or 4 years ago, everyone would face whoever's facing the Browns or the Jets, and just every week you would just play the worst offense. But I feel like when you got like defenses like San Francisco or Dallas, who can just create tons of sacks and also turnovers, which can lead to defensive touchdowns, I feel like there's an added value, to getting a team like San Francisco or Pittsburgh or Dallas on defense.
Yeah, there's 2 ways that people go about it. And I'm actually going to be writing an article for Fantasy Points about this. Some people get a kind of a set it and forget it defense. You draft the Cowboys, you draft the 49ers. They're your defense all year. You don't worry about it, right? You kind of take the good with the bad. Then there's other folks who are going to stream, and they're going to say, I want to look at like the first 3 weeks of the season. Give me a team that's playing against some bad quarterbacks, and I'm going to attack them that way. I'll give you obviously the secret sauce to defense. You want your team to be ahead, so you want a high-powered offense on your side, because that means in the second half of games, these teams you're going against are going to be dropping back to throw. And what do dropbacks equal? Sacks, strip sack fumbles, interceptions, pick sixes. That's why when you look at some of these great defenses, Eagles, Chiefs, 49ers, Cowboys, they all have very good offenses. I'll give you a sleeper defense this year. The Cleveland Browns. Cleveland is loaded on defense. They spent a lot of money in the offseason. Their defensive line is great. I'm an Eagles fan, and I'm reading about, what they're doing in their joint practices this week. They're good on the back end. Guys like Grant Delpit, really good corners. So, if you're just looking for maybe everybody scoops one a little early, and I don't take my defense typically to like the second to last pick of the draft. I'm never one of these guys who in the middle rounds scoops a guy up. And you'll have a guy in your home league like, hey, I'm a Bears fan. I'm going to take the Bears in the 4th round. Like, don't be that guy. All right. Just wait a little bit. But yeah, some of the premier defenses for season long, Cowboys, Patriots defense is always good. 49ers, Chiefs, Eagles, your Bills. I think this year. What do you think about Buffalo? Are we going to see some Von Miller out there running around or what?
I think we could see Von Miller sooner than later, because obviously Javonte, he hurt his leg a little earlier, but I forgot what team it was. Someone, I think it was Seahawks. They had a guy who tore his ACL like 3 weeks after Von. He's already been activated. Yeah, I think Von's coming back. But then you also look at Leonard Floyd, who they also added next to him. And fun fact, I don't know if you knew this or not, Brian, but Leonard Floyd has the most sacks out of any active player on Aaron Rodgers, with 9 career sacks on him in 9 games.
Wow.
So
that's a fun fact right there. Maybe that's the reason they went out and got the former Ram, Leonard Floyd.
Former Ram. He played him back when he was drafted in Chicago. So yeah, I mean, now back to kicker. Is you play the same strategy, kicker, last pick as well?
Oh God, yeah. Kicker is such a streamable position. Sometimes it doesn't pay to get Harrison Butker, because they're just kicking extra points all the time. Some of the great kickers out there, Daniel Carlson of the Raiders. Why? He plays indoors. He's got a huge leg from 50 plus, and that team's offense stalls out left and right. Justin Tucker, you can never go wrong with him. and Tyler Bass, obviously, for the Bills. Here's the great thing about Carlson, Tucker, and Bass. They all have week 13 buys. So you could draft those guys, put them on your roster. You don't have to worry about them for damn near the entire season. I'll give you my favorite sleeper kicker, Brandon McManus, left Denver. Now he's with the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have a very exciting offense under Doug Peterson. And almost no one's going to try to pick Brandon McManus. They're going to think he retired or something because he's not with the Broncos.
Yeah, I kind of did a similar strategy. In my first fantasy draft, I took Matt Gay with my last pick. He's in Indy now, so I think, he'll probably indoors as well. He's got a pretty big leg, so
don't be afraid to stream those kickers.
Oh yeah,
find guys in good weather, good situations. There's a million kickers on the waiver wire every year. It's the toughest position there is to project.
Now, just to wrap up, because I know I said I'll keep it around 30. So, final question. I guess you're looking at your fantasy board this year. Who's a one player that you're trying to get in every single draft, if you can?
Oh boy, who's the player I'm trying to get in every single draft? I could tell you somebody very late. Two guys later in drafts I love getting my hands on are Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens and Michael Wilson, wide receiver for the Arizona Cardinals. Zay Flowers, especially, I think he's going to be the wide receiver 1 in Baltimore, and you don't have to spend a very high pick to get your hands on him. What's somebody I'd love to leave every draft with? The guy I really love getting my hands on Amon-Ra St. Brown. When you see the amount of targets that he can get you 100 receptions. And, this is a team that had a running back score 17 touchdowns, who was Jamal Williams, not on the team anymore. The amount of guys tackled inside the 5-yard line, there's actually a great stat on that, where like St. Brown and DeAndre Swift and these guys tackled inside the 5. It'll blow your mind. And that's why Jamal Williams had so many touchdowns. So I think we're looking at a season with a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown could have a top 5 wide receiver season. So if I can get him on the roster at the end of the first, maybe into the second round, I'm all for it. And I'll be, laughing all the way to the bank.
And I know I said that was the last question, but, I got the sleeper. I guess I'll throw one more out to you. I know you already mentioned Jonathan Taylor, but who else is someone you're avoiding like the plague in every draft?
Oh boy, who am I avoiding in a lot of drafts? I'm an Eagles fan, and I'm avoiding a lot of these running backs. Swift and Penny and now Gainwell, there's talk of him. I'm kind of out on all those guys because, I'm not spending a premium pick on someone who Jalen Hurts is the goal line back there. They're going to mix up every single week. Then you've got Boston Scott mixing in there a little bit. They're a throw first team. And, you just never know. Why get involved in all that nonsense? As much as I love the Eagles, I don't want any of those guys kind of on my roster right now. And what am I staying away from? You know what it is? It's boring guys who don't have receiving upside. I know like Brian Robinson is a guy who comes to mind where everyone's always high on like, oh, this is the year Brian Robinson's breaking out. We got shot last year, which was terrible. But where is his upside in a PPR? They're going to give the ball to Antonio Gibson. They're going to be throwing a ball to Curtis Samuel. They got Chris Rodriguez they just drafted. So stay away from boring guys who are like 2-down grinders. Get people who catch the football because it's the NFL. It's a passing league, and a reception is worth significantly more than a rushing attempt in the NFL. Our guy Scott Barrett did a stat on that. I believe it's like double the amount, like 2.1 points more per reception than it is per carry. So go get guys who catch the football.
That's a great stat. Brian, again, I appreciate it a lot. And again, telling the viewers, you can, find Brian's on Twitter at Drake Fantasy. He has a show on Sirius XM for PFF. And then you write for, it's Fantasy Points, correct?
FantasyPoints.com. Yeah, you can check us out over there. And if any of you guys listening, you're looking to get into the fantasy business, I also run a site called FightingChanceFantasy.com. You can come over there. We've broken in 1 million guys and gals who have gone on to paid work in the fantasy industry, whether it's podcasting or writing. That's where you cut your teeth. It's at FC Fantasy Sports on Twitter. Check it out, fightingchancefantasy.com. We got guys doing NASCAR articles, NBA, MLB, you name it. People are writing about it. So you can kind of, get your feet wet in the fantasy space at Fighting Chance Fantasy. Just hit me up on Twitter if you're interested at Drake Fantasy.
All right. Well, Brian, again, I really appreciate it. You have a good one. Thank you.
Thanks.